I mean, I'm a council estate Englishman. There's no money where I come from. The fact that an institution could spend £20,000 plus on my seat in rehab, there was two things that happened. One, I was going to do anything I could to get sober because I felt so grateful, and I knew I wouldn't let the PCA down because I felt so grateful to be there. And the second thing is it gave me an extraordinary perspective into cricket because
And we're here with our guest, Simon Cusden, affectionately known as Cuzzy. Simon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be here, Z.
So Simon, let's jump right into it. You were a professional cricketer playing at the highest levels. Now you are a coach, a consultant, and you are very focused on helping people with mental health challenges and performance in high stress environments. Why don't you tell us about your journey from professional cricketer to the coaching that you're doing now?
Basically, my cricket career, I brought addiction issues into my professional cricket career. I brought a whole range of what I now know are genetic. I'm an alcoholic, I'm in recovery, I'm 8 years sober. And I brought these things into cricket. And so after my cricket career, I didn't fulfill any form of potential, I would say probably because of addiction and because of a few things that were happening off the field and my inability. Well, it's hard to deal with things properly when you're in active addiction. I ended up going to rehab, which was taken care of by the Players Cricket Association. Must have been 10 years after my career ended. So I went on a very deep, dark journey into, suicide attempts and all sorts of things. Post rehab, I managed to turn that crazy addict mind of mine and that sportsman that needs to be consistently driving myself. I managed to turn that into my recovery and understanding myself. And when I was in rehab, it was very much, I couldn't believe how little education I'd been given around what are thoughts, what are emotions, where do my thoughts come from, who am I, where am I going, where have I been? I suddenly became quite immersed in a very basic education around what it is to have a mind and emotions. And then what I realized is most people are suffering and we don't really understand ourselves. We understand the world and we understand cricket and we understand sport, but we don't really understand what's going on between our ears or, and why are people suffering? I guess my own lived experience then informed a path where people would pick up the phone and ask me, what do I do if I feel suicidal? What do I do if I'm addicted to alcohol, drugs, sex, shopping? What do I do if I'm depressed? What if I'm confused? And I just started to sort of listen and hold the space. And then my twin boys were born. We have twin sons. It was really, I launched myself into it, I launched myself into it so I could be at home more. And now, a couple of years later, I'm privately coaching men who are in high performance positions, CEOs, law partners. I've got some elite athletes in there. And look, I'm not a therapist, so it's not therapy. It's more like triage. If you're bleeding out, I can bandage you up and send you off to the therapist. And as you can imagine, I'm quite busy because a lot of people are struggling. And as I'm going along, I'm getting a better idea on what it is about high performance that creates issues, right? Because there's a lot of addiction issues, there's a lot of mental health issues, there's a lot of bankruptcy and divorce and all sorts of issues with high performance athletes or lawyers, doctors, whatever it might be. Whether it's when they leave their career or during their career, it does sort of lend itself to poor health. That's what I'm up to at the moment.
Wow, that's an incredible journey. And there's a few things I'd love to unpack. So let's talk first about the environment, right? So you were playing at the professional cricket levels in England, about 20 years ago or so. Back in that time, Simon, can you describe the environment in terms of the intensity and the stress, and also at that time, right? We're talking a couple decades ago, the awareness or the sensitivity to mental health issues?
Yeah, I haven't been in changing rooms now, right? But I speak to plenty of people who are, and I would say there's been a huge shift just globally and culturally, right? And as a society, we're so much more switched on around, well, let's call it vulnerability. I think something like COVID came along and made us all really aware of how vulnerable we are and how important well-being is and how devastating, the death of a loved one can be. But I would say that 20 years ago, it wasn't like that so much. My sister had cancer off the field. I was 20. I didn't have any idea of the effect it was having on me. I don't remember anyone speaking to me about it. I don't think I sought that out either. happy there. And in some ways that was a good thing, Z, because what that meant I could do is I could leave my issues at home and I could go and play cricket. But that boundary, that line, right, it's not as clear cut as we think. And we now know that happiness off the field improves performance on the field. And you can't really make that delineation between, well, that's not important and this is important. So I pushed everything that was painful away and I threw myself into cricket. But as my cricket performances started to drop, I had nowhere to go. Home was painful, cricket was painful. And so I went in the only place I could, which was to drink alcohol and try and find pain relievers in the form of addictions. But a couple of weeks after my sister passed away of cancer, I was back in the nets being video cameraed. There wasn't a great deal of empathy or understanding. And for a while there, I was pretty angry about that. I thought I kind of blamed that as to why my career may have not gone where I wanted it to go. But I also now realize that we're all a byproduct of our environment, right? And if you look at the culture before that and the culture before that and the culture before that, it just wasn't really a thing. You just didn't speak about what was going on, especially if you were suffering or if you had vulnerabilities, especially if you wanted to get picked in a team. The last thing you're going to do is go to the coach and go, hey, coach, I'm not feeling great mentally, because the guy's about to pick the team. I hope it's better. I feel like it may be a lot better now. There's certainly a lot more support in place.
Yeah, definitely. And if you look at sort of the cultures historically of a lot of the big cricketing nations, right? Like, Australia and England with sort of like tough male drinking cultures, or South Asia, right, where my family is from, where historically issues like mental health were not spoken about or stigmatized. I would imagine that in cricket, especially back then, the sport itself and the culture of the sport was not conducive to these types of conversations. Do I have that right? Was it particularly a vacuum in cricket, or do you think that was the case equally in all sports?
I think probably most of the culture, not even sport, like I would say most industries, because sport is at that level, sport is an industry, right? Like it's an industry, you're a professional, and I was being paid to do a job. And so if you just take the sports industry or the legal industry or any industry, entertainment, and it was at best there's a get the job done culture, and I would say at worst it's leave your stuff at the door. When I look back on that time, I would say that my male role models weren't the greatest. There was things that I couldn't say out loud on the podcast would occur in changing rooms, and everybody knows that. Everyone knows that was where we came from. In cricket, we saw Azim Rafiq, he stood up and said a few things and went to court. And for whatever that may have done for cricket, I think what it did do is it said we have to be careful, we have to be mindful, you have to be aware of cultural differences, people's mental health, people's emotional health. We can't be unaware anymore and get away with it, because I don't think we did get away with it. I mean, look at mental health statistics now. I mean, look how many people are suicide's the number one cause of death in people under the age of 45, number two under the age of 65. If you look at where the 45 to 65-year-olds were, the way we were raised, something must have not been right for the amount of suicide that we see in our culture, or the amount of chronic illness, or the amount of diabetes, or the amount of obesity, or whatever it might be. We're not a healthy culture, right? We're getting healthier, but we have to be really honest about it and go, people are suffering and people are struggling and people are opting to end their own lives. And, it's almost an unpopular thing to even talk about, but it's real. And then if we look back at the way the culture was 20 years ago, you can kind of put one and one together, and, 1 and 1 does equal 2. I mean, it wasn't particularly compassionate, empathetic, aware, or kind.
But now it seems like that's changed, right? Between, a few years ago, Ben Stokes took a mental health break. Virat Kohli, it's as big as it gets in terms of celebrity and status in the world, not just in sport, was talking about mental health challenges. In other sports, Simone Biles, Naomi Osaka, it now seems like there's been a shift. Is that something that sort of you detect in sort of the communities you're involved with or the players you're in touch with? It feels like a different time.
Almost polar opposite. I mean, it's fantastic. I think about how many, Ben Stokes as a great example of saying, I'm not okay, right? Or his dad died, right? And he was open about his struggle. I mean, people can relate to that. The amount of young people that would be looking up to Ben Stokes and now feel validated to be not okay and to speak about their feelings. I mean, it's a phenomenal thing. And for women, I know that there are women who have missed tournaments because of their menstrual cycles and the awareness around menopause. And these conversations are validating normal human beings. I say normal human beings human beings who aren't at the top echelon of their performance, right? And now it's okay to be vulnerable and be okay because Ben Stokes is vulnerable, and if Ben Stokes is struggling and he still can be a superhuman on the field, maybe it's okay for me to be vulnerable, and maybe I can still aspire to be great at something. So, I think it's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. And it's more common and accepted now, right? Back in the day, you had sort of the exceptional brave individual like Marcus Trescothick was
Yeah,
one of the
amazing,
first to be most
amazing.
vocal, who was kind of like the beacon for this issue. And there were fewer voices, now there's more. I mean, can you talk a bit about, back been open about these things? How was that received, and how did that empower others back then to be open?
Well, I think, see, in the beginning, I don't think it did empower others. I think everybody was a bit sort of shocked and a bit confused. And I remember when Jonathan Trott came home from an Ashes tour, he was called all sorts of things, certainly by the Aussie media. They called him weak and these sorts of things. Now, this was pre-pandemic, pre-mental health awareness days and 80, neurodiverse. I mean, the world is a different place. But I think when Marcus Trescothick first said, I have depression, I don't think anybody really knew what that meant. That shows how far we've come, because that was only 2000, and what would that have been, 2006 or something. So it's only 18 years ago. I mean, that's nothing really for him. I mean, I think about him a lot because he's a trailblazer in terms of the amount of courage that would have taken to have come out and spoken about that. It was easy. It's so much easier for me to say. I mean, number one, I'm not Marcus Trescothick. Number two, because people have come before me and gone, no, hang on a second, I'm not okay. And another great example is, you think about there's been cricketers who have quit the game and gone and done other things. I think of Alex Loudon. I played with Alex Loudon at Kent. He played for Warwickshire, played for England. He quit cricket when his game was right at the top. And Zari, I think the left arm spinner from Surrey, they've just quit and gone, no, I don't want to be a cricketer. That was unheard of. Who did that 20 years ago? No, I think I want to go and work in London and be an investment banker. Now that happens more too, which I think is good.
Going back to your story, Simon, one thing that you said that struck me is when you turned to your network and people you knew, organizations you knew for help, you were well retired. This was several years after you were done playing cricket, but one of the places you turned to was the PCA, the Professional Cricketers Association. And like you said, you feel like you never achieved your potential. You didn't achieve the star status you could, right? You weren't Joss Butler or Ben Stokes crying for help. You were a former player from 10 years ago. And yet it seemed like they had a big hand in helping you get to where you needed to be. Talk to us a little bit about the PCA and the role they play in players' lives, especially now, and how you think they're doing.
I've played like 8 games. I was a professional cricketer for a while, but I'm a nobody. If I compare myself to a Joss Butler, I'm a nobody, right? And that's what we do. We go, Joss Butler, the club cricketer, right? We do that. That's normal and natural to do. So, for everybody to be treated, once you're a professional cricket player, you have lifetime membership, and Joss Butler wouldn't get any more preferential treatment than someone who's played one game. It's a shining light of how a culture should be, right? Because that's equity, that's equality. But it was amazing, and it took me a very long time to fully receive that, because I couldn't believe it for a long time. Like, oh my God. I mean, I'm a council estate Englishman. There's no money where I come from. And so for the fact that an institution could spend £20,000 plus on my seat in rehab, there was two things that happened. One, I was going to do anything I could to get sober because I felt so grateful. And I knew I wouldn't let the PCA down because I felt so grateful to be there. And the second thing is it gave me an extraordinary perspective into cricket, because when I got out of rehab, I went and spoke to one of the guys from the PCA and I said, thank you. Oh my God, I can't believe you put me through rehab. Alistair Cook, I played with Alistair Cook growing up. He's been knighted, right? And the guy from the PCA said, Simon, there is no Alistair Cook. There's no 100 test matches without the cricketer that plays 8 games. How many people have to bowl long hops and half volleys at Alistair Cook for him to get to playing 100 tests, right? And it was like, it opened up my eyes to what cricket is, and what cricket is an ecosystem. You can't play cricket without your mums driving people to the grounds, or scorers, or whites, or the grass has to be mown, or the wicket has to be rolled. And I sort of saw cricket as this ecosystem, this culture, this family of, there is no Alistair Cook without one game Simon or 2 games Simon. Or it gave me a feeling of it validated my experience of a few games, because I suddenly felt very grateful to have even been a professional cricket player. And that was a huge shift from going from, oh, my career failed, to, oh my God, if I hadn't become a professional cricket player, maybe I wouldn't have gone to rehab, right? Because people from where I'm from, council estates, they don't go to rehab because the government waiting list is so long and they don't have the money. And I was one of the lucky, I went from feeling very unfortunate to feeling very fortunate, which I think has been one of the biggest healings I've had coming out into recovery.
That's amazing. Were there particular individuals or departments of the PCA that were especially played an especially large role in your recovery?
There's no way of understating what the PCA has done for me. When I came out, they continued to support me through counselling, and even just now as a member, knowing that if anything happened to me, that it's a form of life insurance in some senses. It's not long term, but I just know that I'm a part of a community that would take care of things. There was a gentleman called Jason Ratcliffe, who was one of the early people who was involved, played for Surrey when I was playing. He was the one who picked up the phone. He was the one who got me approved to go into rehab. So, I owe Ratters huge debt.
It's amazing. The PCA is, I think, the shining example. And my understanding is other professional cricketers associations sort of throughout the world in other nations have been evolving and have been developing and seem to be providing a lot of services for players in a lot of different cricketing countries, which is a great development.
I've had some involvement with, say, the ACA in Australia when I lived out there, and they're the same. And I think the PCA set the standard. I mean, the PCA have been around for a really long time, 50 plus years, I think. But the level of support and involvement they're at now is, I mean, the changes that have been made in the women's game, the PCA, a lot of the PCA behind that, the individuals that are there, I mean, it's a fantastic organisation. My phone does ring. Cricketers, former cricketers, they do call me because I'm one of the cricketers who's in recovery, and they do say, how did you get sober? And I just say, ring the PCA. There's a 24-hour helpline. Give me a call when you've called them. I'll be around, but I'm here because of 12-step programs, counseling, therapy, and the PCA.
That's amazing. So let's talk about a little bit about how you are now giving back and what you're doing. How do you hear from people? I mean, your coaching practice. How do people come into your world? How do people come to you? How, if our guests are interested, how do they approach you?
Yeah, well, I guess it came about by accident, really. I mean, I'm far from a therapist, so I've tried to steer really clear of that because I've had amazing therapists and I'm not a trained therapist. It was born because I realized a lot of people were struggling, and I wanted, part of my own recovery is to help. And I think of it more like triage. You're bleeding out psychologically. I mean, people are dying psychologically. That's why they choose to do the unthinkable. It's really serious, and a part of my recovery is to be vocal and present in saying I've been there and there is a way out and there is hope. There's always hope. My niche within coaching is high performance males. So CEO of a big company, suffering silently is a part of my niche. And, I work with people who are suffering silently, maybe due to shame. Men especially, we have a huge sense of shame, of failure, and coming out. And I work with a couple of decent sized law firms, and they send me male partners. I do some work with the PCA. My phone rings and it's cricketers, or I've got a football player and people like that. And most of the time, it's just I'm suffering. What do I do? I think of it more like brotherhood. I read somewhere, Z, that people, and I'll say men in this context, but it's the same for women, and it's the same. But I read somewhere that men do not need therapists; they need brothers, fathers, uncles, grandfathers, nature, and God. Right. And it was like, I sort of thought, God, that's what's got me sober, right? Like, it's brotherhood. And then women need sisters, mothers, grandmothers, and men need grandmothers. And we're so disconnected that we need, a place to go and go, God, I'm really struggling. And then we're met by wisdom of elders. And if I look around myself into our culture, I mean, our elders are Boris Johnson and all these, we're kind of elderlessness, right? We're elderless. God bless Boris Johnson. But I mean, there's a sense of disconnection, and I read somewhere too, we're drowning in information and starving for wisdom, right? Wisdom, proper wisdom, which is like, sometimes you can't fix stuff. Sometimes you have to endure it, right? Sometimes there's no way out. You have to go through. That's wisdom. That's proper wisdom. That requires old school grit, determination, patience, grace, humility. And we don't live in this world anymore. We live in the like, well, if you've got a problem, you ignore it, numb it, distract yourself from it, or try and fix it, not just like be with it. We don't, I mean, I know in some cultures, death is at the forefront of the narrative because it's the only thing that's absolutely going to happen. But in the Western world, we're petrified of death. So when grief and loss are just not spoken about. Only recently do we talk about postpartum issues. My wife had some postpartum after menopause, postpartum. These are subjects that we're coming into, and I guess my role is to try and be someone who can connect people to wisdom. And the wisdom is, I've had wise men say to me, sorry, mate, you're screwed, and tell me the truth. And it's going to take you a really long time to get well. And you're going to have to show up, and it's going to be horrible, and you might die. Right. That was the big thing. You might die, Simon, if you don't get this, because addicts die all the time. So I try and be that because I'm sober because of that.
So, Simon, shifting gears, last couple of questions, which we like to ask our guests, because first, the cricket world is a community. I just want to ask you, who are a couple of people in the cricket world, today that you really admire and why? And I'm going to ask for two types. One, a player, and two, a non-player, an executive, or an agent or a member of sort of a governing board or anything, right? So who's a player in the cricket world you admire today, and who's someone who's not on the field? A former player is fine, but who's not currently a player who's doing things that you admire?
That's a really good question. Kemar Roach. I like Kemar Roach. He's turning his back on T20 and he wants to be a red ball cricketer, and he's just standing for something. And I love T20 cricket. I'm going to go a bit left field, and I read recently that he wants to play Test cricket, and he turns out for Surrey, and he's flying the flag of proper purist cricket. I think T20 is great for the game, and I think it's brilliant for kids. And I'm not worried about where cricket's going so long as we have people like Kemar Roach. But I think, in that West Indian team, he reminds me of Viv Richards when they gave him a blank check to go and play in the thing, and he just said no. For me, that's, I love that. So I'm going to go with Kemar Roach, and then executive Luke Sutton. Luke Sutton played 500 times for Lancashire, played for Derbyshire in recovery. He's an agent. He's a player's agent, and he just gets it. He gets transition. He gets mental health. He knows addiction recovery. He's just an absolutely phenomenal person, and he manages athletes. God, having someone like him managing athletes. And then the other one would be Jason Ratcliffe, who was the person who got me into rehab. He's also an athlete manager. So I think the fact that they're, working at that level with players is absolutely fantastic.
All right. Final question. Given all the incredible experience you've had, what advice would you give someone looking to break into the cricket world today, either as a player or in on the business side, having seen and learned the things you've learned? What are your words of wisdom for those aspiring cricket industry or cricket players?
I worked with a guy called Mike Hendrick, who was he was the England fast bowler, and he died 3 years ago, and he was old school, and he introduced me to mother cricket. I scored 70 once, and I came off the field, and my head was massive, and and he said to me, did you score 70 today? And I said, yeah. And he said, but you couldn't have scored 70 without there being any stumps. And I went, what? He said, what about your whites? Who cleaned them? He said, what about the scorer? How did they get to the game? Who mowed the lawn? The weather was good. What if it had been raining? You wouldn't have made any runs. What about the people watching? What about cricket, the game, right? And he made me see that mother cricket, when I was playing, I thought that being at that level was everything, but cricket is this huge ecosystem. Joss Butler is no better than the 9-year-old girl who's playing on a Saturday at the club. We all have our little part to play in this game, and we don't own the game. Mother cricket ultimately owns the game. And what I would say was what Mike Hendrick said to me. He said, do not mess with mother cricket. He said, because mother cricket will mess with you. And then he said to me, look after mother cricket, and mother cricket will look after you. And mother cricket did look after me when I needed the game. The game put me through rehab, and that's the game of cricket has changed for me. Cricket is not a professional sport. Cricket is a community, it's a hobby, it's family, it's friendships, it's the local club. That's cricket for me. And then one little part of it is the IPL and Test cricket, right? It's just one, because how many people just don't even want to be a Test cricket, right? So I think of cricket as this vast, infinite ecosystem, and Test cricket and all that is just a part of it.
Amazing parting words, Simon. Thank you so much for joining us. Good luck with all of your ventures, and on behalf of cricket, the cricket world. Not that I can speak for Mother Cricket, but we're all very thankful for what you're doing for the community as a whole.
Thanks, Z.